So, myth number one. Teachers are either progressive or traditional. What do we mean by a progressive teacher or a traditional teacher? But basically, the argument is that progressive teachers use lots of group work, independent learning, student-led type learning, and they focus on the development of skills like teamwork, like evaluation, whereas a traditional teacher will focus on core subject knowledge. So will most often stand at front of the class and lecture the pupils about knowledge, or use textbooks, but won't encourage things like group work or teamwork or problem solving, skills-based lessons. And the head of the Michaela Free School, I can't quite remember her name now, but I read an essay from her recently where she actually says that if they see group work going on in their school, they're really unhappy about it. So they actually actively discourage group work. Toby Young in Prisoners of the Blob claims that the educational establishment here and in the USA shares the same progressive philosophy, which places skills like problem solving and critical thinking above subject knowledge, and that group work and independent learning are superior to direct instruction. And I would argue that probably in the 60s and 70s there was a move towards more progressive methods in teaching, because up until then teaching had been very much you just sit down and you listen to the teacher and you rote learn. And obviously as education was opened up to more and more young people, so as we became more aware of the need for the whole nation to be educated, and children weren't allowed to leave school at 14 anymore, and children with special educational needs were expected to be included, what we found was that the chalk and talk method, if you like, wasn't actually enabling all children to learn. Because when you open up education to all children with all sorts of needs, then you're going to have to use a variety of methods to engage those young people. You know, and you might have young people in the classroom that don't have good verbal comprehension skills, or they're delayed in their understanding of language. So relying on just talking at them is not going to help them to learn. So I would argue that progressive methods did become more popular in the 60s, 70s and 80s, but not at the detriment of the knowledge. We've always taught knowledge. But this is not what Toby Young believes, nor Daisy Christodoulou. Daisy Christodoulou came to fame because she was the team leader of the Open University Challenge Warwick University team. And she kind of capitalised on her fame, the brightest student in the UK, I think she was called at the time. So she capitalised on that, went off to do Teach First, worked for a couple of years in some comprehensive in London, and actually realised that she was really struggling with the pupils. And I've taken this from interviews that she's done. And so Daisy then went off to do a Masters in English. Not sure how that helped her become a better teacher, but then she went back to teaching, I think, for a year. So altogether she did about 4 years in the classroom. And then she wrote a book called The 7 Myths About Education. And in that, she claims that a large swathe of UK teachers are dispensing with subject knowledge altogether and only teaching skills as standalone concepts, because they are under the misperception that facts prevent understanding. So after Daisy's 4 years in the classroom, she now, by the way, runs her own company called No More Marking, which is a private profit-making company that is selling assessment strategies to schools. May or may not be a good thing, I haven't really looked into it, but she's not working in state schools anymore and only had 4 years. She then, after her Masters, I think she went back to teaching for a year and then ended up being the Research and Development Officer for the ARC Academy chain. And she's had a lot of support from the more right-wing elements in terms of, I think it was, I can't remember who runs the ARC Academy chain, but I think it's something to do with the Tories anyway. So she says in her 7 Myths About Education she says one of the myths she thinks teachers have is that we as teachers think facts prevent understanding. No, I have never thought teaching pupils facts about my subject, which is psychology, will prevent them understanding psychology. That really doesn't make any sense either. She also claims that us teachers teach standalone skills without knowledge. So we teach skills as a standalone concept. No. What would be the point of me teaching working in a team to solve a problem if I didn't provide my pupils with a psychological problem to solve? So the idea that a teacher would intentionally teach a lesson without any content in it at all, well, it's just, I don't know how you do it. How do you teach any skills? Anyway, so, I mean, from my own personal perspective of 15 years in the classroom and now going into many, many classrooms, I can tell you categorically that teachers don't avoid teaching facts. And I have never seen a lesson devoid of content, because it's impossible to teach a skill without content. What that doesn't mean is sometimes the skill is the bit of the lesson that's the most important. So it might be you've delivered a content-heavy lesson earlier on in the week to give the pupil some information, and then you might have a lesson where actually the point of the lesson is to practice a skill that they've developed. So yes, you might have a knowledge-led lesson, or you might have a skills-based lesson, but in both cases they will contain knowledge and skills. It's just the emphasis might be different between knowledge and skills. Not according to Daisy Christolini and Toby Young, who are actually very influential voices in this apparent ideological battle that's going on in the UK at the moment. What I'm arguing is that the whole reason the knowledge-rich curriculum is being pushed, and the whole reason these myths are being pushed, these ideas about teachers being progressive or traditional, teachers being influenced by the blob, who are a group of educational experts who are all deluded together about the best way to teach children because of either serving a self-interest or because they've got romantic notions. I don't know, it's all a bit weird. If you read The Prisoners of the Blob, you'll kind of see, Toby Young talks a lot about teachers being stuck in the romantic era, and I have no idea what he's talking about or what that means. So what is to be gained then from what Professor Nick Husbands, who is the Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University and who has a long career in both teaching and educational policy, what is to be gained from this distracting dichotomy that is being pushed, you know, really quite heavily by people like Toby Young and Daisy Christolini, Parent and Teachers for Excellence, Civitas, Nick Gibb, the Education Secretary. And I will argue in later videos that this is very, very intentional, this dichotomy, because it's very important that the power base from local authorities and from Ofsted is eroded in order that we can then, certain facts of society can then build the need for the private sector to take over education, and we can already see that happening, and I'll again come to that in later videos. But so far I've said to you that in my experience I am not a traditionalist or a progressive. I wouldn't call myself either. I am but one teacher, even though I go into lots of lessons. So because I have a huge amount of teaching friends, I just stuck a message out on Facebook and just asked my teaching friends, do you consider yourself a traditional or progressive? I just wanted to see what they would come back with. And I had a really quite massive response from a lot of people I know who are teachers. And in fact, really what came back, which is what I thought would come back, is that they don't really class themselves as one or the other. Or if they do, a couple of them did say, well, I think I'm more traditional, I think I'm more progressive. So I say, some of them may have said, I feel I'm more one or the other. But when I began to ask them in a bit more detail what that actually meant was, what I found was that most of my teacher friends are what I would call pragmatists. They will use progressive methods when they need to, they will use traditional methods when they need to. Many of them talked about the fact that when they introduce a topic, they will pretty much use a traditional approach, and that their pupils like the traditional approach where they will deliver the information in a lecture style. But then when they want the pupils to really understand that knowledge, they will then deliver a lesson that is more skills-based, where maybe the pupils are working together or practicing the skills, and where the teacher can then get around to help to develop those skills. None of them, when I asked them, do you ever teach skills as standalone concepts, None of them said that they did. And in fact, one of my friends remarked, when I told her this is what Daisy Christodoulou was basically saying about education, was, I can't really imagine how you would teach a standalone skill, and also what would the point be? And the example she gave of a skill-based lesson was when because she's an English teacher, is that she will have a lesson where they just take a piece of poetry and practice the skills of critically analysing a new or an unseen piece of poetry. And I said, well, you know, what? She said, I do teach skills on their own sometimes. And I said, so explain that to me. She goes, well, I'll give them a poem, and then they just have to analyse it in groups. Teach them some of those skills of analysis. And so even in her skills-based lesson, she's using a piece of cultural literacy, a piece of poetry that is, you know, a part of our cultural heritage to teach the skills through. And so I have no problem with agreeing with both Toby Young and Daisy Christodoulou that teaching skills without linking it to content, it wouldn't be effective. I mean, Toby Young talks about cognitive science, saying that this wouldn't be effective. Well, of course it wouldn't be effective. You can't teach skills devoid of knowledge. But to argue you can teach knowledge and then not teach skills doesn't make any sense either. When I think about my recent doctorate, most of my learning was done through problem-based learning. So that's where we were in a group of 8 and we were set a problem, a real-world problem, such as around inclusion. Should we include deaf children in mainstream schools? And then we had to produce a product at the end of that. So it might have been a bid for funding to manage mental health in schools. Or it might have been, in the case of the inclusive argument, we had to go to a tribunal to argue for or against a young man being sent to a special school or not. The problem-based learning were intentionally ambiguous. In other words, there isn't an easy answer to them. And so I'd say 2/3 of my doctorate was skills-based learning, but about 1/3 of it was delivered lectures as well. So, you know, depending on what it was we were learning and what we needed would depend on the approach taken. And that's what teachers do. They will take the approach that best suits the material and the people that they're teaching. So the reason I have a problem with the knowledge-rich curriculum is not because I have a problem with the knowledge-rich curriculum. I completely agree we should have a knowledge-rich curriculum. And we do have a knowledge-rich curriculum. If anything, it's becoming a bit too content-heavy at the moment, particularly at primary. And the expectations on children have really increased drastically recently. So what children were expected to do in year 2, they're now expected to do in year 1. So the whole thing is, you know, much more difficult. In fact, to the point where a lot of parents of children with special educational needs are now taking them out of school and educating them at home because it's putting so much stress and anxiety on these children. So if anything, I would say we're getting a bit too content heavy at the moment. But as I say, that's an argument for another day. I don't think this pushing this distracting dichotomy has anything to do with worries about closing the gap, the inequality gap. I think it has everything to do with pushing an agenda around selling educational services, making them profitable, standardising them, and basically it's to do with the marketisation of education. But I will come on to that in future videos. Really on this video I just wanted to really show to you that it's a myth. Teachers aren't either traditional progressive, and teachers aren't just teaching skills as standalone concepts. And hopefully the evidence I presented from my own experience and from the experience of teachers that I know has shown you that to be the case. So I will be in future videos exploring other myths about the knowledge-rich curriculum and putting together reasons why I think these myths are being peddled. Next time I'm going to be looking at the myth that standards in UK schools are in decline and it's the fault of progressive teaching methods.